Welcome to Shoot Like a Girl, a podcast featuring interviews with extraordinary military women from around the world who push their limits on and off duty. I'm your host, Kate Stewart, and this is episode number 17. Today's guest is Lieutenant Andrea Howard. Andrea has an insanely impressive resume. She's a nuclear submarine officer in the United States Navy. She was not only a student at top-notch schools, including the United States Naval Academy, King's College London, and Oxford, but she was involved in many activities, societies, and athletics. Andrea was also named one of the 25 LGBT Next Generation Leaders to Watch by the Atlantic Council. I was honored to have her speak with me about her life experiences and her career.
Steady, nice and steady. Light, hill, cover. I'm a steamroller, baby.
I'm a steamroller, baby.
Just a rolling down the line.
Just a rolling down the line.
I'm a steamroller, baby.
I'm a steamroller, baby.
Just a rolling down the line.
Just a rolling down the line.
So you better get out of my way now.
So you better get out of my way now.
Before I roll all over you.
Before I roll all over you.
So, Andrea, thank you so much for being here today. I saw your profile on LinkedIn and I was blown away by all of your accomplishments and your education and just everything about you. I was very impressed. So a little bit intimidated to be here talking to you today, but I'm really excited for this interview.
Let me just start by saying that it's a total privilege to be included amongst these warrior women that you've highlighted so far in your podcast, particularly Senior Chief Shannon Kent is an inspiration. Her story gave us a little bit of insight into the incredible initiatives that women are a part of outside of the spotlight of the mainstream media. And so your endeavor is trying to get more of these ladies' stories told. And I, like I said, am astounded to be included in this group. And I'm really excited to chat with you today.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I want to help tell as many stories as possible. So very happy that you're here today and you're going to tell your story. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in Norcross, Georgia, and always alleged that it was one of the best places that I could have grown up in the United States. Norcross really felt like this microcosm of America with all these ethnicities that span the globe. It was a true cultural melting pot. At one point, my little tidbit I like to throw out is that Gwinnett County was the fastest growing county in the United States. That was due to immigration and families that were seeking refuge after Hurricane Katrina. On the day-to-day in my Metro Atlanta public school system, I loved floating between lunch tables and appreciating the nuances and differences in Asian, Latino, Indian, and Black cultures, whether that was food, music, or linguistics. My kind of pitch that I always say about Atlanta was that again and again, I would stumble into this Groucho Marx paradox. He said, I don't want to belong to any club that will accept people like me as a member, but they all kind of organically did. So like, for instance, my favorite Spanish class in high school surrounded me with students from all over Latin America. And I would always get caught kind of poking different friends there and asking them like, how do you say this word in your country or in your country? So I really grew comfortable as kind of a non-native speaker in that class. Only a handful of us weren't. And then later I would go on and do things like math team and be a minority as a woman in that culture. So in Norcross, it was almost like a student could feel like they were traveling the world without ever leaving home.
That's so interesting. When I grew up in Halifax, and it wasn't very multicultural at the time. I think it's getting to be a little bit more now, but I did spend some time living in Toronto, and I feel like that sounds like what you're describing, but probably a little bit colder in Toronto. But just there are so many different areas with people from all over the world and just different restaurants and the little villages. And I really loved that about Toronto. I find it so interesting. So what were your interests during childhood?
All sorts of things. I will say that unlike in Toronto, I never really had a winter jacket in earnest until I finally left Atlanta. But going back into the high school lens, I was really a social floater. My mom taught math at my high school, which most teenagers would have totally dreaded, but I loved it because she became a sort of universal mother figure to a lot of my peers. So I spent time with her doing these academic endeavors like math team, as I mentioned, but most of my energy still went into sports. I played softball and golf and had incredible role models in the forms of coaches and teammates. One of the most impressive organizations I joined, however, as a little Norcross pitch again, was the high school basketball team. My coach, Angie Hembry, grew a nationally ranked program there and coached some of the greatest players in women's history. So that would include Maya Moore, who was at one of my sister high schools that Coach Hembry had previously coached at. But then I got to play with people like Diamond DeShields and Dearica Hamby. I read a lot of John Wooden memoirs in that time, and the morality and work ethic that he found in basketball translated well into the start of my naval career.
Yeah, it really sounds like that laid a great foundation for you and your work ethic. From what I've seen so far and read on LinkedIn, I mean, you've accomplished so much in your career and extracurriculars. So what was the population of your high school? I know that in my graduating class, I probably only had a couple of hundred students.
Yes. So for example, my math class had over 40 students. I think we physically could not fit more than 45 of us. There were 4,000 students total. And that was kind of reflective too, like I mentioned, of that trend analysis of Gwinnett County expanding more than any of us could have anticipated. So each grade then roughly had over 1,000 students. And that kind of started to pare down too over the course of our time in the school. So at age 16, students could elect to drop out of high school and pursue different technical routes or go into family businesses. And that was really prevalent in Norcross as well. So my graduating class started with roughly 1,100 students and finished with about 600. But all in all, it really gave me this, again, snapshot of all the different conditions under which people live and cultures from which they grow up and set the moral foundation for the rest of their lives. And a lot of people at the Naval Academy, when I then left Atlanta and transitioned to Annapolis, hadn't had that exposure. And, Annapolis does its phenomenal job in translating people from high school students into naval officers. But when I got to the fleet, the dividends that were provided by Norcross really started to show in that I was able to relate to sailors from all over the United States because I had that little slice of America in Norcross and in that high school that was 4,000 students.
Yeah, I would imagine that would be a huge asset in a military environment. So when you were growing up, did you always want to be in the Navy?
Absolutely not. I was what I would call a late bloomer. My family history is laced with people who were called to service in all different forms and fashions. The really explicit military tie came during World War II when my grandfather on my mother's side served as a Army Corps of Engineers technical sergeant. He was mostly deployed to the Philippines. And unfortunately too, he passed before we really could dig into the stories and narratives that he could have shared from that time. But one of my most prized possessions is a photo book that I have of him on his various escapades through training, with his brothers actually in front of monuments in DC and these really iconic looking pictures before he then actually deployed. And he took a lot of photos with locals. And it was kind of doing, the civil military relations thing all the way back in the 1940s on the adventures that he took. So that sense of duty was instilled then in my Italian American family from the immigrants who had come over preceding World War II, the service that was then given and sacrificed by my grandfather's family and my grandmother's family, and then ultimately passed on to my parents. In regards to the Naval Academy, though, my brother had two friends in high school who recruited for Navy swimming, fitting, probably the most, waterborne sport that you can get suckered into. So I seriously also looked at the Air Force Academy. And even though I believed that I wanted to study aeronautical engineering and become an aviator, I was attracted more by the rough and tumble culture of the Navy relative to the other services. And there's a long traditional line that extends far beyond the history of the Air Force in the United States. The whole culture also didn't revolve just around flying, but rather a diverse set of platforms that covered all facets of the sea. And so one of my driving tenets in life is to pick options that yield the most options. And the Navy very much so aligned with that ethos.
I know in Canada, I think the Navy would be, if you want to deploy more and visit other countries, the Navy is definitely the way to go because, we do always have ships deploying, whether it's to Europe or into the Pacific areas and South Asia. And that's just an opportunity that, depending on what trade you are, a lot of Air Force or Army members might not really get to travel that often. So in Canada, I'll just explain a little bit. So we have the Royal Military College. And in Canada, everyone in the Army, Navy, and Air Force, they all attend the same university. We have two of them. One is French and one's English, but everyone attends the same university. And before they start, they already know which branch and which trade they're going into. So they know whether they're going to be, say, an infantry officer or, a Navy engineering officer or artillery officer. Is it the same for the Naval Academy?
It is not the same for the Naval Academy, nor the Reserve Officer Training Corps program, which students attend at civilian institutions, and they're then required to do additional trainings outside of their normal curriculum and day-to-day pace at the school. At the Naval Academy, the process of finding out your community is known as service assignment. So that title by itself connotes that there is an element of selection outside of the student's control. Students are ultimately assigned communities based off the needs of the Navy. That's kind of a quote that a lot of officers will ironically adopt and apply to various points of the career in their orders and assignments. So needs of the Navy really dictates it. That said, there are screening processes for some communities, and students also sort of naturally break down into the numbers that are required every year. I'm sure there's something to be said for the people that they recruit and the preferences that they also display, and how that then shapes up for each class, normally getting what the Navy also sort of wants. Looking at some of those community-specific requirements, the nuclear, surface, and submarine communities permit early selection in the spring before the fourth and final year of school. And that's after undergoing technical interviews with subject matter experts at naval reactors, and then a one-on-one interview with the 4-star admiral who runs the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program. All other students find out their assignments one semester later. So that's in that first semester of the fourth and final year at the Naval Academy. And then the Marine Corps and special warfare communities have physical screeners the summer before that. So you can kind of early select nuclear programs the spring of the third year. Summer that is ahead of the fourth year permits these physical screening opportunities for really physically intense communities. And then everybody finds out their communities of the remainder of the class for that first semester of the last year.
Okay, so then during the school year, I assume obviously you're doing your schoolwork, and what sort of military things would be involved in what goes on during the year?
USNA is pretty unique in the fact that military culture and life pervades nearly everything there. So during the academic year, it really does feel like a normal institution in the fact that classes and academics are the priority. That said, there's these little, noticeable differences that permeate the daily life. So you attend class in uniform. There are new meal formations in which the student body lines up before marching in to then eat lunch communally. We have this massive dining hall where we host guest speakers and visitors to the campus who also get to then dine with the student body and kind of see the traditions and maybe rambunctious behavior is the right word to say of the students in the dining hall. There are also formal parades in the fall and in the spring once the cold weather has been kind of surmounted. And, that certainly is a distinguishing feature from normal colleges. The crux of the military training occurs in those summer periods between the spring semester concluding and the fall semester kicking back off. So the summer after freshman year is when students, without COVID being a factor, would go out to the fleet and tail an enlisted person on a cruise, either in aviation, the surface community, or submarines. Then the summer between the second and third year is when students do almost a taste tester of all the communities. So they rotate through a 4-week program with 1 week of exposure to aviation, surface, submarine, and the Marine Corps communities. And then that final year, the summer beforehand, students will go and tail a community with which they think they want to be affiliated. So if you wanted, for instance, to be an aviator, then you would tail an aviation squadron, ideally going underway on a carrier.
That's so interesting doing it that way, because at the Royal Military College, you've got to pick your trade without knowing too much about it. A lot of people have only seen videos online of supposedly what their job is, or maybe they've spoken to 1 or 2 people. But that's such an interesting way that I think it should be done, because you're making these decisions for life, right? Without really knowing what you're getting into or what a typical day on the job looks like.
Yeah, and it's almost like a personality test in some ways, because like I said, there's these permeations of military life into the day-to-day existence at USNA, the military instructor and civilian balance there is approximately 50-50. So just by taking classes at the institution, you inevitably also interact with people that come from all these different communities. And that's where I think students really start to own in on what community best aligns with their personality. I always kind of really jived with the nuclear trained personnel, which characteristically are a bit nerdier and more academic. But okay. I own that. And I love the folks that are kind of intellectual and, very heartfelt and community focused though, too. So I thought again that I wanted to be an aviator, and kind of the bravado of the aviation community actually didn't jive as well with me. Where I really started to connect with submariners that were my instructors.
In the Canadian Navy, the officers who are the bridge watchkeepers and in command of the ship, and the deck officers are called naval warfare officers. So that name change has come quite recently. They used to be called maritime surface officers, and then there was maritime subsurface for the submarines. So what piqued your interest in submarines rather than surface warfare?
Sure. I self-classify as someone who appreciates social settings, so it might be a bit confusing that I would prefer naval service aboard a confined submarine, a metal tube under the water. And so during my interview to become a submariner, Admiral Richardson, who was the director of the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program at the time, glanced over my resume and understandably demanded, why does a political science and Arabic double major want to serve on submarines? I started with a 2-word answer, and I adhere to this answer to this day, and it's the people. So sailors in the submarine force relative to the surface Navy or the aviation community have this reputation for supreme intelligence, and in an environment where negligence can result in nuclear meltdown in the very worst case, the reliance of one sailor upon another really inspires trust. And it's not just the aft engineering component of submarines that also demands this level of diligence up forward to the sonar technicians, the fire control technicians, the personnel who provide backup when you're giving helm orders, also really have to be in the raw data, providing an independent backup, mechanism to the person who's making decisions. So I've really cherished the relationships that I've formed during my time aboard submarines because of the closeness and trust that they afford. And that's a little bit more intimate than is permitted really in the surface community, where hierarchy has to dictate a bit more given the number of people on board. I also really look forward to the diplomatic and policy connections that are facilitated by a career in submarines. Submariners have the opportunity to guide international discussions on nuclear modernization and nonproliferation as advisors, or as Jimmy Carter represented in the probably most eminent case, as political leaders. And submariners bring operational experience into these conversations, which is really a unique element that the civilians in these fields cannot provide. As I discovered during my first underway in a ballistic missile submarine, which was USS Louisiana in 2013, submariners can literally sleep between Trident ballistic missiles at night, awake to the tensions of monitoring an active nuclear reactor during the day, and then become those operational experts that can guide the future of nuclear power ashore. So what really differentiated submarines from the surface community to me were those 2 factors of the people and then the hands-on experience with nuclear reactors and with nuclear warheads that can facilitate the ultimate drive, hopefully, towards nonproliferation.
Yeah, it's definitely just that environment where there's, especially on a nuclear sub, zero room for error. We don't have nuclear subs in Canada. Our subs are diesel electric. When you're under the water and pressurized, a small error or a small thing that happens just becomes a much bigger problem. We did have actually one submariner die. The HMCS Chicoutimi caught fire years ago. So that was a terrible incident. Whereas if that was on a ship on the surface, I'm not sure of the magnitude of that fire, but that might have only been a minor thing on a surface vessel, but it's just everything's so much more magnified in a submarine. It's interesting also, just when we were talking earlier about the different pronunciations. So in Canada, we say submariners, but you guys say submariners.
Well, that is a debate that I refuse to engage in. Submariner versus submariner is something that cannot be resolved within the American military. A lot of the older guys who will talk on this subject will express the reasoning behind their preferences. I go with submariner because submariner maybe connotes that you were beneath the mariners, which I guess physically is true. However, I don't want the performance piece to have any bit of confusion. So I'm a submariner who works on submarines, in my humble opinion.
Okay, excellent. I mean, and you guys have more subs than us, so I think you can take the decision on the pronunciation for that.
Sure. Yeah, I was going to touch on this notion that you said of kind of being worried about these incidents that have happened on international submarines, and then, even on the USS Connecticut that had a collision in the South China Sea in October of last year. Am I personally worried about operating on a submarine in these mishaps? No, I personally am not. Trust is really the bedrock of operations on submarines. You have to have, like I've mentioned, this absolute reliance on one another. And we have really rigid procedures that we follow both forward and aft, and these review processes for how we operate during dynamic evolutions, but like reactor startups and shutdowns, or building navigation plans for when we're operating submerged in different areas of the world. Rigid adherence to those procedures and having the integrity to carry them out ends in success. Deviations from those, at least in the American submarine community, is where these mishaps start to happen. Any person on a submarine who is qualified in submarines and has gold dolphins for officers, silver dolphins for enlisted personnel in our community means that that person can save the ship. So we always love to use this quote, fight the ship. And when people are going up for boards to get those submarine warfare insignia, what that means when they walk out having passed that board is that they are experts on damage control, on casualty response into things like fires, floodings, hydraulic ruptures, high pressure air ruptures, nuclear casualties for the people that are engineering qualified. And then for the officers, it also means that you go one step further and you're not only worried about fighting the ship internally with all the mechanisms and mishaps that can happen, but you are also then trusted to take that boat and go fight potential adversaries. That is what our community is founded upon, is that principle of trust and of being able to save your shipmate, as long as you have the level of knowledge to take the right actions and then you execute them as expected.
There have been sort of a number of the high profile catastrophic incidents in submarines in the past few years. And when I think of going on a sub, it would make me quite nervous, although I am a diver. So some people would say that would make them nervous or claustrophobic feeling, but I think it would be more, I guess, when I'm diving, I feel like I'm more in control, or I'm in the water, not in a tube that's underwater. Sort of similar in a sense that you're under pressure and the effects of that. And I don't know if I'd ever be able to go in a sub unless I was James Cameron, and I had, admittedly, if I did have, millions of dollars, I probably would buy my own sub and go to the Titanic.
Yeah, we can't fault James Cameron for that for sure. I think another interesting thing to talk about, though, is just the training pipeline that even precedes the time on a submarine. Mm-hmm. So like one of the main tenets to note is that the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program, which I keep mentioning as this entity that kind of controls submarines, is that it has the trust of the public as well, because of the nearly pristine track record of American submarines, and particularly regarding engineering operations. Most of the mishaps that you've mentioned are really pertaining to navigation. A lot of them are when submarines are surfaced, which is not our kind of natural mode of operation, and when our maneuverability really is restricted. On the engineering side, there is a pretty much clear track record and a very strong culture of self-criticism. So backing it up, in the realm, again, of level of knowledge, before a future submariner even gets to a boat, he or she will undergo a year of training that precedes that operational command at sea. So there's a 6-month classroom portion of training that covers, in an academic setting, reactor theory and thermodynamics, radiological principles, and electrical engineering. Then the students proceed to a hands-on training command for another 6 months, where they stand watches on decommissioned submarines with active reactors. So they're moored in place and the propeller is also removed, such that there's no actual motive force away from the pier. And it's there that there's all these redundant and reliable procedural and equipment-based safeguards in place, so that most of the residents of Charleston, South Carolina, where this training command is located, might not even know that there are running reactors less than 10 miles from downtown. And then on the day-to-day operational tempo underway, when sailors finally report to their commands, again, they were so drilled with these 7 principles of watchstanding, and I won't go over them here in case any submariners listen to this. Don't want to, showcase the nerdiness and the Kool-Aid too much, so to speak. But, this premise of integrity as being central to all, and then having a questioning attitude to take care of issues before they become real problems is in the subconsciousness of these sailors based off the training programs that they've completed. External to the crew, ever since the loss of the USS Thresher in April 1963, there have also been these huge overhauls in quality assurance to ensure that the material integrity of the boats is maintained during maintenance overhauls in the initial construction phase.
So how many sailors or submariners would be on a sub? How many different classes of submarines does the US have?
Let me make sure my math is correct. So there are 4 models of submarines right now. We have on the fast attack side, the oldest class, the Los Angeles class, which are 688 classes. They're called the 688 class. There are also 3 Seawolf class submarines. That was a program that was started in the 90s and was ultimately terminated as the shift went from a platform in the Seawolf that was able to go super fast and super deep and had a lot of firepower to something that was stealthier, a little bit slower, but could be more cost efficient. That came in the form of the Virginia class submarines, which are one of the main construction focuses. Then you also have the Ohio class submarines. There's 14 of them. They constitute the majority of really the money making for submarines within the Department of Defense structure, because the Ohio class submarines are responsible for nuclear deterrence. So there's 14 of them that are ballistic missile submarines. Then you also have 4 of them that have been converted to what's called guided missile submarines. I served on one of those guided missile submarines. So the amount of space on an Ohio class submarine very much so overshadows the amount of space on all of the fast attacks. So when you took a ballistic missile submarine and removed the Trident D5 missiles and replaced them with conventional Tomahawks, the amount of strike capability that those SSGNs were able to punch is incomparable to any other subsurface platform. On top of that, because of the extra space afforded by Ohio class submarines, the SSGNs can carry more special forces riders, which facilitates really interesting underwater kind of covert deployment of special forces.
Right. Yeah, I've seen very vague pictures of SEALs, and I guess maybe they can sort of link up with a submarine and their SEAL delivery vehicles or deploy from the subs.
Yeah, unfortunately, can't really talk about that too much, but we were able to work with SEAL Delivery Vehicle Team 1 on my last underway and do some of those interdisciplinary operations and joint operations within at least the Navy side. You had asked earlier too, how many personnel are on board a submarine. Again, it depends on what platform, but roughly the number hovers around 150 sailors per boat. You said submariners, so there's a population of people on board that are submarine warfare qualified. You do not get to call yourself a submariner until you actually get pinned with your fish, so to speak. So you'll always have a contingent of probably, let's say about a fifth of the crew that's working on qualifications. And then sailors are obviously going to be cycling out over the course of your time on the submarine. For officers, that typical tour length for both junior officers and department heads is approximately 3 years. For sailors, you'll see something more in the range of 4 years on the shorter end to 6 on a longer. So some sailors will spend 6 years on the same platform and really kind of go through this life cycle of shipyard and operational periods, which is really impressive. And those are the people who arguably really run the boat because they have the most knowledge of its quirks and ticks, because every platform really is different.
That seems like such a big number. Don't quote me on this because I'm not sure exactly, but I believe on the Canadian Victoria class submarines that it's somewhere around 50 crew.
Yeah, I mean, that's impressive that they're able to operate in that fashion. I imagine a lot of the difference in numbers probably comes from the engineering department on nuclear submarines, because that is our largest department and constitutes almost half the crew, really.
And so on these subs, without revealing any operational security or anything like that, even if you could just give ballpark numbers, but what would be the deepest that they go and how long can you stay underwater for?
Yeah, I can't comment at all on depths. That is classified. I can say that in regards to length of time underway, it varies because the only logistical piece that is limiting you is the amount of food on board and the health of the crew. There are obviously human emergencies that sometimes alter timelines if you're able to get people out of your operating environment and back home for those various contingencies. So yeah, if you can feed the people underway, then fuel is not a concern because your uranium core will not be depleted in anytime soon.
So, in a submarine, does the internal pressure remain pressurized to a certain depth, much in the same way that, say, an airplane would be pressurized to only 8,000 feet, even though they're at cruising altitude?
Yeah, again, I don't want to delve too much in the construction of submarines, but there is a pressure hull that is maintained at a livable pressure. And then external to that, the pressures of the ocean can be felt at these various depths, but the materials of the pressure hull preclude that external force from varying the people space pressure, as we like to say.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I'm sort of interested in all of that stuff, I guess, from the diving side, right, where we deal with those pressures and decompression sickness and those sort of things quite a bit. So one of the things I was curious about, because I know absolutely zero about anything nuclear, but occasionally you hear of people in certain towns where, there's going to be a nuclear submarine base being built and they're protesting against this. So what would be the main concern for a population if something were to go wrong on a nuclear submarine?
What I'll really just say is that there are so many safeguards and procedures in place that it almost is a non-issue. And I'm not just saying that from the perspective of somebody who benefits from being in this nuclear program. There have been no major radiological incidents ever on US nuclear submarines in terms of our operations and the way that we manage those safeguards. But in the very low statistical possibility that a major radiological event transpired, there are emergency actions and plans to execute that would contain the contamination and most of the radiation in hull. And then there are, again, procedures that would validate that exposure off hull is limited. So off hull meaning anything that did manage to sneak out, that it won't really reach the public. And if, again, in the absolutely insanely low chance that it did, then we would certainly measure that level of radiation. But like I said, this should not happen. There are so many things that would have to go wrong, both in terms of operator error and then also just equipment error, because we design these plants such that if the operators totally fail to take the appropriate actions, the plant should shut itself down before any sort of damage occurs.
Interesting. Yeah, I think some people maybe have the idea that it would turn into this big explosion like Hiroshima or something like that, but not that I'm an expert, but I don't think that's what would actually happen.
No, that absolutely would not happen. Yeah, really the real answer is that based off of all of these safeguards and tests of equipment we have, the plant will shut itself down. So nothing bad would happen. There was a Facebook post that I saw that was titled "How to Simulate Being on a Submarine for Your Family at Home." And one of the kind of metaphors was like, have your kids disassemble every piece of equipment and major appliance you have in your home, and then reassemble them just to validate that they're still working. That's kind of honestly the maintenance cycle that we go through of repetitively and periodically per prescribed schedule, making sure that everything is functioning as it should. And then particularly if there is something that is a little bit tweaked, even in the slightest, that's relating to protection of the reactor, there are very stringent and tight requirements that will indicate that there's even a minor chance of something happening well in advance of having a system failure.
Okay, interesting. I feel like I'm learning so much from you. I'm going to need to go and do some more reading and research on the American submarines after this. So to take it back to your Naval Academy days, so you had a major in Arabic or minor in Arabic?
Yeah, absolutely. Minored in Arabic. I also at the time was looking at prospectively majoring in Chinese. I'm of the Jewish faith and love kind of the dynamics of Middle Eastern culture and all the different conglomerations of nations that are there and peoples that are there. And I wanted to dig into that a bit more. And Arabic was really the tool set in order to better understand, like I said, the existing cultures and rich cultures in that region, as well as the dynamics of the very complicated issues that are prevalent in that region.
And then you were chosen to do a semester abroad in Oman, is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. Oman really shifted my paradigm of how the world functioned. It was the first time that I left the United States in earnest. I previous to that had been in Ireland for a Navy football game, American football game. So, having shifted from being in Ireland to a weekend to spending nearly 4 months in Oman, my whole worldview very much so kind of crumbled in the best way possible. So I devoted the first semester of the fall of 2013 to this Arabic immersion program there. And I was living with my host mother, Joha, for 3 months of that time. And despite my, I'll call them culturally out of place behaviors, like running outside as a woman, Joha's family really adopted me. They would dress me in these beautiful homemade abayas and take me to their women's weekly formal gatherings, and then subsequently showed me the elaborate welfare system and kind of emotional support system that the women really run from their homes. Joha's family demonstrated this perfect model of support and trust, giving that generous financial and emotional assistance to one another during prosperous times, and then relying on the network when they themselves were kind of in stressful periods. And that family model exists all over Oman. And I kind of drove how I looked at and approached some of these Navy communities when it came time for my service assignment. I wanted a community that demonstrated that level of support, and I found that in the emotional and intellectual support that submariners are really kind of forced to provide one another.
So did you find it hard to adjust? Like you said, running outside, were there other things that you couldn't do that you wanted to do?
Not really. I will say that you get a lot of attention as a woman not dressed kind of traditionally there. And so that was certainly a psychological shift, just having to get used to kind of having eyes at you at all times. It almost made me more empathetic with really famous people in the United States or kind of in Western culture more broadly, who never really get that sense of privacy when they go out to just do mundane things in their day-to-day life. Other than that, though, not really. The program that we were involved in and the teachers we had were really invested in trying to give us kind of an authentic experience of all that Omani culture had to offer. There is kind of this bifurcation between informal gatherings with men and with women. So in some regards, we kind of split off and did our own things when in those more traditional settings. But I'm very grateful for that too, because I almost lament the position that some of the guys were in, because like I said, the women really do run a lot of the social and welfare oriented cultural kind of projects and initiatives in that country.
So were you studying with any sort of military academy, or was this strictly just a language program?
It was strictly a language program, but there were participants from the U.S. Department of State. And then we had some students from civilian colleges as well. So University of North Georgia actually had a pretty strong contingent that was represented. And that in of itself was nice too, because you had folks who were a little bit more professionally established. And then for those of us who were confined to this military institution that is Annapolis, we were also able to kind of branch out and have a friend group with the civilian college students who were there, driving this common goal of all of us improving our language skills and understanding the culture a bit better there.
Right. And I'd imagine it would be just so much better living with a host family rather than if you were all in the same dorm room, just sharing a space.
Certainly. And my family was awesome in the fact that they really wanted me to understand Omani celebrations. That's such a core tenet of their culture and their way that they express that communal happiness. And so there were some really impressive henna artists in my host family. And I kind of mistimed the last henna that I got, such that when I had to report back to the Naval Academy, I still had some remnants of it. And it was tactfully covered by my uniform that day, I must say. But yeah, my host family very much so drove a lot of the language learning that occurred there. And, after I graduated, I also did a language program that's funded by the Department of State called the Critical Language Scholarship. That was in Azerbaijan for 8 weeks. And I went from being a novice to an intermediate mid-level proficiency in Azerbaijani Turkish. And the driving factor for that was really just kind of diving right in. That program provided language partners. So each student had a dedicated language partner. And while it's great to kind of root yourself in grammar fundamentals and vocabulary, just diving in and, unabashedly making mistakes in conversation, I've found is the best way to build those language skills.
Yeah, that was one thing I found really fascinating about your LinkedIn profile is all these different languages. And coming from Canada, we have 2 official languages, English and French. So most people grow up taking the second language in school. And most of the time, after you're a few years out of school, you kind of forget the second language. So it's kind of a little more uncommon for Westerners to speak so many languages. Or personally, I'm very fascinated by it, but I find it really hard to learn. So that's why I was really curious what your methods are and how you managed to learn so many different ones.
Unfortunately, my retention of those languages has atrophied just by a product of being on a submarine for the majority of the last 3 years. Regardless, though, the languages for me very much so were just, like I said, a key that unlocked those cultures. I very much so am a believer that you don't get to delve into what makes people tick as much if you don't make the efforts to learn their language, and then to just read some of the key texts that define a culture in the host language. I'd love to build those language skills back up, and I think I still have the pillars of grammar rules lodged somewhere in my head that could be resurfaced and rebuffed if required. But more so than anything, learning those languages was the window into the authentic parts of that culture. In all the different places I was able to practice these critical languages.
Yeah, I'm sure if you went back there, it would probably take no time for that to come back to you. I know I took French in school, and without practicing too much, a little bit here and there with the French guys at work, but I did my language placement test and did quite well with that, just from what I didn't even realize was stored somewhere in the back of my head.
Yeah, I'm certainly impressed by that. I'm not ready for any tests anytime soon, I'll tell you what.
Continuing on this topic of your education, so you did your master's through King's College in London. Was any of that distance education, or did you go to London to attend school?
Yeah, no, I was thankfully in person for 2 years in the United Kingdom. 1 year at King's College London, KCL it's called, and 1 at the University of Oxford. The opportunity to develop diverse relationships beyond the classroom, especially the unexpected friendships, was by far the most interesting aspect of being on the Marshall Scholarship there. That scholarship is shaped around the spirit of General George Marshall in the reconstruction of Europe post-World War II. And so with that, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the UK sponsors roughly 40 Marshall Scholars per year to strengthen that enduring relationship between the British and American people, their governments, and their institutions. So I was in person, and the Navy saw the value of that kind of in-residence education because I was able to do things like collaborating with naval officers from countries outside of US alliances when I was at King's. And then at Oxford, my closest relationships in my MSc in global governance and diplomacy were with development workers who typically don't interact with in a positive fashion with people associated with the military, or just kind of more broadly don't necessarily support military power and kind of these hard power norms that, for better or for worse, define a lot of the international arena. Then I got to do things like play basketball at the varsity level at KCL and at Oxford, which further expanded the breadth of nationalities in my friend group. But above all else, I'll just say that me being there in person, coming off of great education at the Naval Academy, allowed me to put some pretty nicely wedded critical thinking skills and just a friendly face to this monolith that people perceive as the American military. That I think is the dividends that are paid in having these junior officer ensigns in the Navy go out and do really a diplomatic kind of flavored educational mission for the American military.
Right. You were saying sort of before we started recording that you grew up in that environment in America, and then you didn't sort of realize how it was perceived from the outside until you went over there.
Yeah, most certainly. I gained this appreciation for the opportunities that are afforded to American citizens who join the military But then I also had a little bit of self-reflection in noting that other countries who don't have these huge military industrial complexes that support such a large military institution might not perceive the military in the same fashion, and that individuals that are in those organizations might then not have the same kind of educational push that's provided by the American military, and then propulsion out into the civilian world afterwards. In the Royal Navy, for instance, a lot of the bonds are kind of driven by families who are more historically rooted in that institution, whereas the American military is very much so just this hodgepodge of people who come from all walks of life in all different places across the country, who are looking for an adventure and an opportunity to better themselves and get to a better place on the other end of that service, whether it's a 4-year contract or 40 years.
I do listen to a lot of podcasts. Most of them are American, and you do hear those stories about, someone who is a financial advisor or a banker, and then just sort of realizing that wasn't what they wanted to do and that they wanted something else. And then they're off to join the military. But then at the same time, there's the student enrolling just fresh out of high school going to join. And in Canada, I find that a lot of newer people that are joining are quite older compared to pictures or what I read about the new recruits in the States.
Yeah, I mean, we still have a heavy focus on the population of students that are coming right from high school. And, that's one of the major draws for me to actually stay in the Navy a little bit longer, is the opportunity to work with these 18 to 20 somethings who come in so optimistically and are willing to be shaped and to change at their ethical cores and their intellectual cores, and then either, like I said, stay within the institution or go out and do greater goods as citizens and civilians within the national fiber. It's really astounding. Submarines have become, only in the last 10 years, we haven't touched on this yet, submarines in the United States have only become accessible to women in the last 10 years. The initiative was expanded to include women in 2011, which meant that the first women showed up to submarines after that 1-year training, and in 2012, and started qualifying in submarines. Where we're really at, though, is the opportunities for women in submarines on the enlisted side now. So I helped integrate at least USS Ohio, my previous boat, which was the third submarine to include junior enlisted women across the entire crew. We were then the first crew to execute a mission with junior enlisted women on our particular boat. And then the long-term plan is that by 2030, there'll be 33 submarine crews that are going to have female officers and 14 crews with female enlisted sailors. And all classes of submarines will also be integrated with female officers. So the Los Angeles classes that we touched upon, although most of them might be decommissioned by that point, Seawolf class submarines will certainly be integrated. And I have a friend who is going to start that process this fall. And then the Virginia classes are starting to be integrated as they're being constructed. And then we'll have Ohio class submarines that still have women on board, to include my submarine, and the Columbia class ballistic missile submarine replacement will also have women on board. So in terms of like my personal trajectory, I just went from the oldest operating submarine in the fleet, which is the USS Ohio, the namesake for the Ohio class submarines. And then I should hopefully be getting orders to the USS New Jersey, which is the newest Virginia class submarine. And it will also mark the first submarine that has been built within the Virginia class to include junior enlisted women. So it will be the first fully integrated junior enlisted women submarine in the Virginia class. So I'll go from oldest boat in the fleet to newest boat in the fleet, helped integrate the oldest, and will hopefully help integrate the newest to include these junior enlisted women. So there's something poetic about that, and I'm excited to delve into that opportunity as a department head for these next 3.5 years.
Yeah, that's really amazing. I know for Canada, I believe it was 2002 that women were allowed to serve on submarines. So for us, it was actually quite a bit earlier that women were able to enlist in all trades. So women have been allowed in combat trades since, I believe it was 1989. And obviously there are stories about women not having the best time serving as infantry officers or soldiers in the combat arms, but it has been open since that time. And I know in the US, it's a little bit different with regards to certain jobs that women can and can't do. And I know recently, I think they've opened up the possibility of women attending BUDS or SEAL training. But at this point, I don't believe that anyone has made it through.
No women have unfortunately made it through BUDS and through the SEAL training pipeline that then follows to become a Navy SEAL. That being said, our timeline kind of lagged Canada's then, because the combat exclusion ban was lifted in the 90s, and there was this amazing tribe of women that integrated, surface combatants in these aviation squadrons during that decade. And then more communities became open to women really around the time that I was graduating from the Naval Academy in 2015. Submarines obviously were kind of the last, I won't call it non-combat, but the last really non-physically intensive community that required integration. And a lot of the debate, from what I understand, because I truly just joined the Navy in 2011 at the time that conversation was happening. So a lot, from what I understand, was really just a cultural piece of reconciling how, men who were in the community were going to cope with the change and embrace it, as well as their families too. And, in some ways I've heard that the family piece was almost more contentious and took a lot of growth and reflection for the whole community, active duty members and spouses and their families, to really align and progress forward. We always kind of joke though that within the submarine community, looking back, 2011 was this landmark year because there were 3 big changes, one of which really overshadowed the other 2. So women in submarines was announced. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed. So that same-sex and LGBTQ relationships were then permissible within the community. And then the third thing is that smoking was banned underway when submerged. And people always kind of lightheartedly joke that smoking being banned underway was by far the hugest cultural shift, and the one that had the most pushback in the submarine community in 2011, because some of the old salty sailors really loved smoking their cigarettes in the engine room.
Yeah, that seems so crazy. I mean, on the ship, you can be on the upper decks and get fresh air, but I can't imagine being enclosed in a sub and just filling the air up with smoke. But I guess that's like back in the day, the McDonald's used to have the smoking section and in half of it.
Yeah, I mean, the atmospheric equipment that we maintain on board can filter that out. It really just became kind of like a health related decision.
Right. And so going back to the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, so that is in another sense, I guess, where Canada was a little bit more ahead. I know that historically, if you were to do any sort of research on Canada, I believe it was the 80s, and they just settled a lawsuit with some of the victims. So they had this gay purge, essentially is what they called it, where they were having the military police investigate members, and they were sort of shuffled out of the military. And so now the military has done an official apology, but I believe it was the 90s that they got rid of that policy. And again, I'm not part of that community, so I can't speak for anyone, but it just seems to me like there's been so much progress made. Before I attended basic training, we had sort of lessons on how to conduct yourself in the military and how to wear a uniform. And the petty officer that was giving us that class was saying, like, you're not allowed to go to a pride parade and wear your uniform. And then the past few years, it's like my unit in Toronto had band marching, and the chief of defense staff was there, and the admiral of the Navy, and everyone's marching in the parade, right? So I'm sure there's plenty of work still to be done, but it's come leaps and bounds in the past decade or so.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who identifies as female, use she, her pronouns, and who is also part of the LGBT community, my wife is very much so my rock and supporter in terms of my ability to function on a submarine, and also just as an element to bring to the wardroom spouses and kind of fiancés and boyfriends, girlfriends, and that group that copes while we're underway and out of comms. We have something to bring to the table. I'll precede a question that I'm sure you'll ask, which is kind of advice that I would offer to women wanting to join the Navy or military more broadly, or LGBTQ personnel that are interested in this career path. And I'll be honest in saying that you do have to steel yourself, but also become part of this greatest tribe that you could ever possibly gain in your life in the military. And then within these subsections of family that are women in the military and LGBTQ personnel in the military, you'll have to really be competent above all else. You need to almost operate at a higher standard, because there are these expressly shown biases against you at times, and there are measures in place that help mitigate those, but there's still these subtleties of how people perceive you and treat you. However, you can set the standard because of your otherness in some ways. My friend Phoebe Kotlikoff, who left the Navy now and is at law school at Yale, and who was on my sister crew on USS Ohio, wrote an article for US Naval Institute Proceedings entitled Gender Still Matters. And her main argument was that being a woman in submarines wasn't necessarily a bad thing when she felt that feeling of otherness, because she was able to leverage that to help elevate the entire organization to a better place of professionalism. Having somebody who doesn't quite feel the pressures to meld into the organization, and who other people that exist in that organization can then kind of test these boundaries upon, gives her and gives the rest of us a place of power to improve the culture and propel it and make it more professional and more inclusive. You know, my major kind of way that I view myself as this minority in submarines is through this concept that Tom Friedman called STEMpathy in his book, Thank You for Being Late. So it's obviously a combination of STEM, the science, technology, engineering, math, and then empathy. And what I really just mean by that is that we're working on some of these most existential issues of our time in nuclear modernization and upholding the triad while trying to balance that with nonproliferation. But ultimately, you're with just this diverse group of people, and the best way to operate in that environment and to handle those issues is to have as many different perspectives as possible.
That's such a good way of putting it. And again, I'm sure you're infinitely smarter than I am. But I mean, do you find, like, have you seen progress in that sense through your career since you joined? And have you had significant obstacles that you've had to overcome in that sense?
I wouldn't say that I've necessarily had significant obstacles when you view it from the perspective of mentors that I've had who were forced out because of don't ask, don't tell policies, or, you know, women that have preceded me that didn't even have the opportunity to be in submarines. There are still these instances, though, in which, you know, you recognize that a person in command or in that chain of command isn't being as open with you as a woman that he's being with the guys. And that's kind of like the subtle biases that I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. And then maybe that's also sort of reflected in your performance. So there's nothing that I can explicitly touch upon in regards to how I've been treated. I'm very, very grateful to be a part of my community and to really more broadly then also be a part of this network of women that is within the community. With some of the friends that I have that are also delving into this department head experience, we founded this group called Submarine Officer Women's Network, and we have 200 and nearly 50 officers within this organization. And it's the first of its kind that's connecting officers who are getting ready to be executive officers. That's really the front tip of the spear, so to speak, for women in submarines. So people going into their third sea duty. And then we're able to connect them with people who are starting their second sea duties, those who are already on their second sea duties, those who are engaging as junior officers for that first sea duty, or those who are about to commission as midshipmen from the Naval Academy and these other commissioning sources. So, you know, what I can do in regards to my experience and some of those subtleties that I've encountered is to connect this group of women and create a mentorship network such that folks that are going to go through the same thing that we did have people to lean on and can take our lessons learned, which is obviously a huge submarine thing in terms of procedural operations, both forward and aft, but also take those lessons learned socially and apply them so that we can continue to grow as a collective and just propel forward as a team.
Propel forward. I like that. So this networking, is this strictly with women in the States, or do you network with other submariners from around the world?
Right now, it's just confined to American submarine women, mostly because it's kind of an ad hoc organization that we put together. Really, too, it also, I think, allows a little bit of like intimacy and openness about the training pipeline and just the weird cultural tics that we have. That being said, you've sparked an excellent idea for me to then reach out to some of our sister nations and, you know, maybe put on some events and opportunities to connect more broadly. That would be awesome.
Yeah, I'm curious now that we're having all these discussions. I'm going to have to go and look up. I mean, I'm not sure exactly the number of women who serve on submarines in Canada. Like I said, you know, our subs are way smaller. So I would imagine it's only a handful. And I'm not sure. I mean, I'd imagine some of the other countries probably might still not allow women to serve on subs, but it's interesting. I'm going to go research that after this.
Yeah, I mean, that'll be a fun rabbit hole to delve down. Yeah, there are a number of nations that do allow women on submarines, and most of them that do preceded the United States. And you could write a whole thesis on why certain nations allowed that decision earlier than others, but based off societal norms and just number of platforms that are available for women, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, it really is a nice notion, though, that we can find the similarities and differences within this subsection of the military that is women in submarines around the world.
And are there any other topics that you really wanted to say get out there or talk about?
No, I really think we kind of covered the range of topics that encompasses, the educational opportunities that are afforded within the U.S. Navy, at least through the lens of international education, and then the culture shift too that's been happening in submarines.
Yeah, even with regards to education, it's something that I almost wish I had known more about in high school, because even though I was in, one of the Navy cities in Canada, which is Halifax, where the East Coast Maritime Forces Atlantic base is, I didn't know anything about it because I didn't have any family members in the military. So I didn't see that as an option. And I had no idea all of the different trades that were available and within the Army, Navy, and Air Force, and the educational options that are available. So I guess that was another reason maybe why I started this podcast, is to just sort of showcase all of the opportunities that are out there and what women like you are doing with all of these incredible opportunities and this incredible education that you've had and all this stuff that you've done, right? A lot of people don't know that that's an option and that's out there.
Certainly. I think in an alternate reality, had I not joined the Navy, then I would have very much so stuck to living in Atlanta or living on the East Coast, wherein with the Navy, I've been able to live in Europe for 2 years, to spend a significant portion of time, up and down the East Coast, then in the Pacific Northwest these last 3 years, with different adventures peppered in Hawaii, Guam, and the Western Pacific. And for that, I'll forever be grateful, and truly could not remove at this point in my life the fingerprints that the Navy has kind of left on my heart and soul.
Right. So what are your goals for the future, personal and professional?
On the personal side, my highest priority is just to kind of keep my family number one through all the craziness that is a lifestyle in submarines. So my wife and I would love to have children at some point or adopt, but grow our family. And that comes above everything else. On the professional and personal melding side, though, I would love to just continue, like I said, to build this tribe and mentorship network for women in submarines, and then take that experience at whatever point, whether it's after a 20-year career in retirement or beyond at higher levels of leadership, or really even just after this next tour. I'm hoping to take that experience and leverage it to do more good in the realm, like I said, of nuclear non-proliferation. Nuclear proliferation remains one of the most existential threats that plagues our world at this time, and it's so complicated and interdisciplinary. But I'm currently on a temporary assignment at Department of Energy in the National Nuclear Security Administration in DC. And what a treat that's been, because I can assure you that the people that are working these issues are some of the smartest I've ever encountered across these educational institutions that I've attended and these different places I've been in my career. The folks that are working at DOE on these issues are super interdisciplinary minded. They are technically savvy, but are able to communicate on a policy level. And that STEMpathy piece that I talked about is so prevalent. And, like I said, I could really see myself coming back and working in conjunction with them or with them directly. But yeah, that is the issue of our time that kind of sits in my consciousness. And so maintaining, like I said, that family piece, and then hopefully making the world a better place for my family and for families and friends and loved ones is the ultimate goal.
Any higher education in the future for you?
Oh, geez. I'm a little bit tuckered out from school, and I'll have to do a department head school. That's 6 months starting in March and then finishing up in August, at which point then I'll report to my next boat, hopefully the USS New Jersey. Beyond that, I would love to do a PhD someday. I just need to figure out exactly where that fits in, and if an international option is a choice again.
Oh, I feel so almost inadequate talking to you. I've been trying to plug away at this undergrad and just taking like one course here and there while I'm working. And I'm like, how can people do this? And some people take multiple courses at a time while working full time. And I just come to the conclusion that I'm just not very academic.
All I'll have to say about that is that lifelong learning is always a priority and should be occurring at whatever level. I've just been very fortunate in kind of having the dominoes fall in such a fashion that I could pack in a lot of that higher education really early in my 20s. But I'm still just trying to learn tidbits every day and read and consume information so that I can, ultimately work towards that PhD. But, offline, off the scope of these diplomas, the real learning is what's happening kind of on the deck plate on these submarines, from both a very technical standpoint, but also just a social dynamic as I'm learning more about myself and my leadership every day.
I feel the same way in that sense. Just the past few years at work, I've learned so much. And I mean, so much more than what a leadership course in the military can teach in, like a couple month period, right? My big question that I ask everyone, and you sort of touched on it earlier, what advice would you give to women wanting to join the military?
Yeah, I think I covered most of the points earlier, but the one that I'll explicitly drive home is to create a tribe. So, find mentors ahead of you that have taken the steps that you're going to try to retrace. And then find people that are at the highest levels of the military who are willing to kind of give top cover and hear your ideas. It can give you that outlet off whole, and then utilize and leverage those connections to take care of your people. So it's a forward facing kind of network that you're building to have leaders that are directly in line with what you're doing, who can give you that larger perspective too, with some higher top cover. But those are the folks that are going to help you be empowered to take care of your sailors and to grow a team. So the tribe is essential to success in the military.
And so just listening to you speak and listening to your answers, I mean, have you ever thought about going into politics?
To be determined.
Okay.
That's what I have to say there. I really, I mean, the main piece is that I still feel very called to the ideals of the Navy, and I don't feel like my time is done with this institution yet. Not to say that I'm going to revolutionize it, but I'm really excited to be a department head as a submarine on a submarine, and to, be in charge of a department of 60 odd sailors and build that culture and manage that group of people at this next level of leadership. And if I feel like I can continue to contribute and my family can sustain this lifestyle, then I'd love to continue on and hopefully be selected for command someday, based off just this cultural moment where we are of women in submarines. That would be one of the highest honors of a lifetime. And then beyond that scope, I'm not sure, but I know that I will continue to kind of stay rooted in federal service in some form or fashion, whether that is on the political realm or maybe in something like a national laboratory, whatever it may be. There are ways to serve, and COVID has really, I think, been the factor that's highlighted for us that service comes in more ways than just those that are uniformed.
Yeah, I mean, that's so amazing. You're so impressive. And I think the US Navy is so lucky to have you. And I'm sure all of the sailors that serve under you, just such an amazing person for people to aspire to be like.
I mean, that is possibly the highest praise that I could hear. And I hope my sailors certainly feel the same. I couldn't think of anything that even comes close to comparing to the relationships that I formed with the sailors, and hopefully the ways that I was able to improve their life outside and within the Navy, and just their level of knowledge as humans, and like I said, these lifelong learners and people that I'll maintain in my orbit for the rest of my time on this planet.
Well, I'm sure you'll go on to do amazing things. And thank you so much for your time. This was a really impressive interview. Again, I was very intimidated, but this was really great. Thank you so much.
Kate, I just really have to thank you for having me on here. I am humbled. The people that you've included in this project are giants, and I just really hope that you can utilize me as a resource to connect with people who are far more impressive and accomplished and are doing these amazing things to improve the military within the United States, and then just the representation of women on the global scale. and just showing that we are the warriors who will hopefully shape whatever comes to be in regards to tensions as they escalate, or in the worst case, conflicts if they do break out.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to help support this podcast, please subscribe and leave a rating and review on your Apple Podcast app.